Zelensky, of course, disagrees after 365 days of war, a grim milestone in Putin's unprovoked invasion of Ukraine. And after a year of death and destruction, Russian forces occupy some 17% of Ukrainian territory. That is considerably less than what Russia controlled in the weeks that first followed Putin's initial invasion. And today, Ukrainian President Zelensky vowed to keep fighting until Russia retreats.
If we all complete our tasks, victory will be inevitable. I am certain there will be victory.
But as we have seen over the past year, Ukraine's victory is coming at a heavy cost. Just today, the head of Russia's private army, the Wagner Group, is claiming that his forces have seized another town. This town is just north of Bakhmut, home to some of the deadliest fighting. New video today shows Putin's forces under attack. You can see them taken out almost one by one. The losses have been devastating for Putin. More than 100,000 fighters are said to have been killed. Ukraine's resistance comes as the U.S. is now targeting the face of Russian state TV, sanctioning the woman who you have seen on this show many times, spreading Putin's propaganda since the start of the war.
A real war has already begun. World War III. Our army is really powerful. There's no disarray in the highest echelons of power.
Why bomb Ukraine when there is England?
We should have done it there today. All the best people were at her funeral today.
And tonight, there are growing fears the war in Ukraine could take another dramatic turn as it enters year two. Sources tell CNN U.S. intelligence now suggests the lethal aid China is considering sending to Russia includes drones and ammunition. Clarissa Ward is out front in Kyiv for us this evening. Clarissa, where is the focus on the ground tonight on what happens next?
I think the focus right now, really, Kate, is on the east, and particularly looking at Bakhmut, where Russians have been making incremental gains pretty much every single day. There has been a lot of speculation that Ukraine was getting ready to cede that city any moment, that they basically just wanted to get through the anniversary. But officially, the message today was an upbeat one. We heard President Volodymyr Zelensky, who gave a very long press conference to journalists here today, who also went and handed out medals to soldiers, saying that he believes that 2023 can be the year for victory. I think a lot of people across the country would love to believe that too, but I think there is also a lot of clear-eyed realism about the number of challenges ahead, and that's why you've been hearing Ukrainian officials relentlessly asking again and again for this heavier weaponry that they believe they need to win this war once and for all, Kate.
And as President Zelensky did predict today that Ukraine can win the war this year, I mean, you've spent so much time covering this conflict over the last year. What do Ukrainians really say they need in order to pull that off?
Well, obviously the bar keeps moving, and this is part of the sort of tension or discussion between NATO and the U.S. and Ukraine, because they keep asking for more and asking for more. One of the major things that they needed in the short term at the moment was ammunition, because they've been burning through it at a rate that the U.S. and NATO can't keep up resupply to. But more importantly, arguably, if they want to meet this marker that they've now essentially set themselves, with Zelensky saying 2023 is the year for victory, they say that they need to be able to go on the offensive. Part of that will be some of these tanks that the U.S. and Poland and the U.K. and Germany and other countries have agreed to give. But part of that, they say, needs to be things like long-range artillery that can hit the Russians at a greater distance, and also the fighter jets. I mean, you just played the clip from Biden's interview with ABC News, where he appears to rule that out. When I spoke to a senior Ukrainian official just the other day, he was saying that they had impressed upon Biden and his team when he was visiting here just how important this was for them, and that, quote, it was now in America's hands and that America understands. So it'll be quite interesting to see what response we hear from Ukrainian officials to that essentially revelation that the U.S. for now is ruling out sending fighter jets. I should add, though, the U.K. has said that they would send them. They say also with a qualifier that it will take years to train pilots on them. But this is something we'll be watching very closely in the days and weeks ahead, Kate.
Yeah, and I guess now probably Ukrainians are wondering and wanting to parse through what for now means and what President Biden told ABC News this evening. It's good to see you, Clarissa, as always. Thank you. Let's go to Fred Pleitgen now, who's in Moscow. Fred, China just put forward this 12-point plan that they say will bring this conflict to an end. Is there anything to this peace proposal? I mean, what is Russia saying about this tonight?
Yeah, well, I mean, the Russians obviously love this peace proposal. The U.S. has already criticized it, so there's very little new in it, called the pro-Russian peace plan. And Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, he also came out today and he said, look, he's happy that the Chinese are putting something like this forward. But he also says, quite frankly, the Chinese need to talk to the Ukrainians as well, and not just talk to the Russians. So there is a lot of criticism out there. Nevertheless, the Russians, for their part, are saying they quite like what's in this peace plan. There's two things that the Russian foreign ministry today has sort of picked out. On the one hand, it criticizes some of the sanctions that have been placed on Russia. Obviously, the Russians very happy to hear that. And then also talks about alliances in Europe not being too strong, obviously a criticism of NATO. Now, the Russians have said that, yes, of course, under certain circumstances, they would be willing to find a political solution to this conflict. And then they sort of put forward in a statement of the foreign ministry under what circumstances that would be. So I want to read that to you really quick. They say, quote, this implies the cessation of supplies of Western weapons and mercenaries to Ukraine, the end of hostilities, the return of Ukraine to a neutral, non-aligned status, the recognition of new territorial realities that have developed as a result of the realization of the right of the peoples to self-determination, demilitarization and denazification of Ukraine, as well as the elimination of all threats emanating from its territory. Aside from the fact that this denazification, it's not really clear what exactly is meant there. Essentially, what the Russians are saying is that if there is going to be negotiations, if there's going to be a political solution, they want Ukraine to give up, to surrender, to give up large parts of its territory, and to give up its entire army as well, Kate.
Fred, thank you very much from Moscow for us this evening. Up front with me now is James Clapper, former director of national intelligence under President Obama, also retired lieutenant general in the U.S. Air Force, and Ian Bremmer, president and founder of the Eurasia Group. Gentlemen, it's good to see you this evening. Director, Biden saying tonight that Ukraine doesn't need F-16s right now, but Zelensky, even today, was calling again on the West to provide them. Who's right?
Well, I think actually President Zelensky is, to be honest. I think the administration is losing an opportunity here to exert leverage by simply announcing that we're going to enter Ukrainian pilots into training and their maintainers to support the maintenance requirements of F-16 and then reserve judgment on when and where to deploy them later. The problem is these weapon systems get more complex. They require more lead time to train the Ukrainians, set up the supply and logistics. So I think it would be show support for the Ukrainians and convey a message to the Russians if we simply announced that we were going to start a training program for the Ukrainians on the F-16. Because ultimately, maybe they don't need it today, but they're gonna at some point, because that's, air defense is a requirement for the Ukrainians, and the F-16 is a capable air-to-ground attacker. So I would respectfully suggest the administration consider announcing that and then reserve judgment on the actual deployment for later.
It's an interesting point, Director, that even the announcement, even though, as we've seen with all of the other announcements, and then how the actual delivery comes months later for some of these more complex systems, the announcement itself can work as a deterrent and send a strong message. Ian, just broadly, as we're sitting here on 365 days into this, where do you see this war standing 1 year in?
Well, for the last year, the level of support that the United States and the allies have provided to the Ukrainians has been extraordinary. It's been staggering, really, well beyond what anyone would have expected, including the Ukrainians in the early days, as well as the coordination in punishing the Russians. The big question is, can that persist? Certainly, you are starting to see a reduction of support among some Republicans and certainly among public opinion of those that tend to vote Republican, as well as among independents. And the Europeans are watching that carefully. They're deeply concerned about it. When I was in Munich at the security conference last week speaking to a lot of Ukrainian officials, they don't like this formulation of the Americans saying, as long as it takes, because they feel like time is not working in their favor. They need as much as possible, as soon as possible, because if they're still fighting in 2, 3, 4 years' time on their ground, their economy is going to be completely destroyed. They're concerned about that. The final point is that China, of course, is now playing a greater role. And the fact that they've put forward this 12-point diplomacy plan is not going to be accepted by the Ukrainians or the Americans, but it is going to be accepted by all the developing countries in the world. In fact, if you didn't know that China had written this plan, could have easily come from India or from Brazil or South Africa. That's a problem for the United States. It's a problem going forward in terms of how this conflict plays out.
That's interesting. You know, Director, speaking of China, from an intelligence perspective, what do you think of this new reporting that that U.S. intel suggests that China is considering sending drones and ammunition to Russia? Having American intelligence even put this out there does what?
Well, I think it helps to. It's a good use of intelligence to exert some pressure on the Chinese. Hopefully, leaning on them not to do this, not to provide weapons to the Ukrainians. Now, whether they will or not, that remains to be seen. But I think this continues the pattern of operationalizing the use of intelligence either to pursue a military objective or, in this case, a diplomatic one, by diming out the Chinese in advance and hopefully putting some pressure on them not to provide weaponry of any sort to the Ukrainians.
Yeah. Ian, when it comes, if China isn't deterred, if they do decide to go ahead and provide the drones and the ammunition, what do you think the United States and its allies should do if China crosses a line here? Do you think the West should be drawing a red line on it?
Okay, I think one of the interesting things over the course of this war is that the Chinese, for all of their support of Russia diplomatically, they really have been on the sidelines. In fact, actual Chinese policy towards Russia has been virtually identical to that of India, which is, of course, much more aligned with the United States. If they were to provide direct military support for Russia, that is a red line. And that's why it's so important that not just the Americans, but also the UK Prime Minister, the NATO Secretary General, they all coordinated in making these very strong statements over the last few days that there will be hell to pay if the Chinese actually decide they're going to put their thumb on the scale in that way in favor of the Russians. I think you would see direct sanctions, secondary sanctions from the United States against Chinese firms. And while the Europeans would have to debate this very strongly because, you know, their economies are already getting hit a lot harder because of this Russia war, I suspect that most of them, especially the Germans and the French, would be aligned with the United States. This is the exact opposite of what the Chinese wants to see happen going forward. So I agree with Jim. It was a good use for operational intelligence. And I personally would be quite surprised if the Chinese went ahead and actually did provide these weapons in the near future.
Stand by on that one. Ian, thank you very much. Director, thank you as always. Out front for us next, remarkable video of a Chinese fighter jet flying just a few hundred feet from a U.S. military plane, and CNN was on board during the encounter. Fighter jet flying just a few hundred feet from an American reconnaissance plane. CNN was on board the flight over the South China Sea when the Chinese jet, armed with missiles, made the aggressive move. Chinese planes have also been seen further intimidating Taiwan. Taiwan's defense ministry says 12 Chinese warplanes recently crossed into Taiwan's air defense zone, with 37 more planes spotted around the island. Frequent moves like this only are increasing the concern that China is now preparing to invade Taiwan. A group of members of Congress just returned from Taiwan, one of them joining us right now, Democratic Congressman Ro Khanna of California. He's a member of the Armed Services Committee and also a member of the new Select Committee on China. Congressman, thank you for coming in. After your visit to the island, are you more or less concerned China's preparing to invade Taiwan?
I'm less concerned if we do the right things. First, we need to honor Taiwan's defense requests. They have $18 billion of requests for Harpoons, for Stingers, for HIMARS. We've got to get them those weapons. But at the same time, all of the parties in Taiwan believe that they can preserve the status quo and have engagement, and they want to actually have dialogue with China while beefing up their defense. I think the combination of that can avoid war.
U.S. officials say that more U.S. troops are going to be headed to Taiwan in the coming months to train Taiwanese forces. The Pentagon has said that that there right now are about 20 to 40 troops there now. Have you been briefed on how many are going?
Kate, I don't know the specific numbers, but when we met with the defense minister in Taiwan, he did say that they are working with our military for training, that they really appreciate that training, that it has helped given them insights on what needs to be done. We need to continue that training, and we need to provide them with the defense weapons that they have requested.
But are you worried at all that sending more U.S. troops could inflame tensions between the United States and China even further, the message that it would send, especially in this moment?
Okay, not if we affirm our one China policy that President Carter helped formalize, and that is to say that we affirm the status quo. We understand that the talks over Taiwan will be peaceful between China and Taiwan, but the United States will not tolerate a violation of that peace agreement and any military action. If we have deterrence combined with dialogue, I don't think it has to inflame the tensions.
You know, American officials are worried that China is going to start sending lethal support to Russia's war effort in Ukraine. And CNN has this new reporting that lethal support could mean drones and it could mean ammunition, which would be a very big escalation in China's support to Russia with regard to this conflict here. What should the U.S. do if China crosses that line?
Well, one, the United States should make it very clear that there will be consequences. Those consequences could mean economic sanctions. Those consequences could mean sanctions on the individuals and companies supplying those arms. That would be a really serious violation of international law and helping Putin with an illegal war. And I'm glad that the Biden administration has made it clear that that would be crossing a line.
You know, the British Foreign Secretary was on with us last night, and he questioned why China would want to link itself to Russia like this. Let me play for you what he said.
I can completely understand why Russia would try and seek an enhanced relationship with China. But the point I made to the Chinese authority, to Wang Yi, who I met with, is I cannot see how it can possibly be in China's interest to import the level of criticism and international condemnation that would inevitably come with any supplying of military equipment to Russia. I can see what Russia needs from China. I cannot understand what China might realistically want or need from Russia.